it's time to go back to the second panel, which is very close to the first one. And I had to separate both, but I think you will find also that second panel very interesting. The next panel is completely virtual. So as you can see in our program, and for the one who arrive a bit later, so we have program outside, but you can also download on our website the program. But the second panel is called Lived Experiences Under Scrutiny, Learning from the Service Member themselves. So you can already see how it's close to our first panel. And we will begin by Jennifer O'Neill. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being asked to present. My name is Dr. Jennifer O'Neill. I'm the director of the School of Social Work, as well as an assistant professor at the University of New England in Portland, Maine. And the title of my study was Acknowledge Us, an exploration of the lived experiences of female Army veterans in undergraduate programs in the United States. The purpose of this research was to explore the lived experiences of female United States Army veterans who have enrolled in academic undergraduate programs post-discharge from the service. This study had two guiding research questions. What is the lived experience of fully separated female Army veterans in undergraduate programs? And also, what opportunities and challenges do female veterans describe during their transition to higher education? This study had a pretty wide recruitment parameters, with the most specific one being that they had been Army veterans, and that was based on which branch in the United States actually has the most women who are enlisted in the branch, which then gave me the largest possible sample pool of people who had discharged out. So they had to be fully discharged. They could be any age. They could have any MOS, so any job within the military. There was no requirement of deployment, and they had to have entered a bachelor's program post-separation from the Army. It could have been a second bachelor's, but it had to be a bachelor's, not a master's. The sample was an interesting sample. It was wider than we expected. So there were 13 women from 5 different eras, the Vietnam era, the 1980s peacetime era, which really is not peacetime. It's just there are no declared conflicts. Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and then Operation Enduring Freedom. So having women from 5 different eras was an unexpected phenomena, but it opened up some really interesting conversations, especially with the women from the Vietnam era. And the participants ranged in age from their mid-20s to their late 60s. A really quick breakdown on the methodology. This was a qualitative study. I used phenomenological methodology, focusing on the lived experience of these women. Each woman took part in 2 semi-structured interviews, at least 2 weeks apart, to allow them space for reflection. And the questions revolved around time in the military, transition to civilian life, experience in higher education, as well as family history, how they ended up in the military, and some more general kind of experiences of their life before the military. So we were drawing on the work, I was drawing on the work of multiple people. So veterans in higher education in the United States is a really under-researched topic. And there is even less research on female veterans in higher education. So I examined this population through many different lenses via the literature to get a sense of what frameworks might be best for female veterans' experience. So I drew on the work of Yuri Bronfenbrenner and his ecological theory, which focuses on the person in the context of the environment that they're in. Malcolm Knowles and the concept of andragogy, which provided an important framework for non-traditional adult learners. And finally, feminist research Carol Gilligan, whose work began when she realized that all of the research being done was centering on the male experience and the male voice. And she set out to make sure that women were not only heard, but their experiences are validated, which is something I was also trying to do. So after multiple rounds, 6 or 7 rounds of thematic coding, which really brought the information down to its kind of purest form, There were three major findings with multiple sub-themes. So the first finding is military culture, which I've already heard talked a little bit about today. And that really is, it's like its own world that you have to learn how to be in, and you have to learn how to survive. And then you come out of that into a whole different culture and expected to be able to relearn those rules as well. So the women, they really seem to enjoy a sense of belonging in the military, and they missed that in higher education. The military provided a team-based approach and a structure that left very little, at least on paper, to chance. And then the hierarchy of the military provides a structure that becomes comfortable, and it makes sure you know kind of what's always going to be next. You know what the rules are, you know what paperwork to fill out, who to ask for what. And higher ed is completely unstructured. And for those of us who work in higher ed, we can, I think, agree on that. And you can ask many people the same question and get a different answer. There isn't always an appeal process for what you're dealing with. Several participants struggled with what they called the casual nature of both higher ed and traditional students. And I had a lot of my people in the study talk about things like students coming into class really late, not being dressed for class, being in pajamas. And those were things that really seemed to get under their skin. The second sub-theme that I came across was the transition experience. Oh, I'm sorry. You know what? I think I just lost. Yep. The second sub-theme was the transition experience. They felt the lack of readiness that they experienced. They didn't feel like they'd had sufficient preparation for the transition out of the military. They often felt rushed, unable to absorb all the information that they were being given to them at a rapid pace. And this was especially true for those who had just come from deployment. Some women talked about not being ready for the demands of higher education, and several deferred after being accepted. There were some unsuccessful attempts at first and some failed classes. All of these women were ultimately successful, but it took some longer than others to feel ready to navigate higher education. This was also somewhat dependent on the age of the enlistment. For example, I had one outlier, Tara. She enlisted at 28. She felt like she had a frame of reference as an adult to be successful. Her dad was also retired military and helped her to process everything. And just to go back to military culture for 1 minute, when asked about their experience as a woman, the answers were often based on the era they served. For instance, in the Vietnam era, women had makeup lessons and flag folding as part of their basic training, because their basic training was gender specific. Regardless of the era, none of the women in the study saw that gender was a limiting factor, even when basic training was difficult and their gender was used against them in some way. So when we get back to the second sub-theme for this finding, the role of veteran services at the university and higher education in general. Understanding the role that veteran services play in a female veteran's experience seemed like a good entry point into being able to understand their experiences in higher education. Participants who attended institutions that scaffolded their services as part of orientation, advising, use the services more, often because they were not given a choice to not use it. In this study, this seemed only to happen in the larger universities. Most of the women spoke about the certifying official in the registrar's office or having an advisor, but again, this was part of the time frame in which they served. Veteran centers are a fairly recent introduction, but seem to be the least used service by my participants. Several participants reported that when they attempted to use the Veteran Center, they found staff in the center were unhelpful, didn't know answers, and seemed to be uninterested in engaging or helping them. And the third sub-theme here was help-seeking behavior. Not seeking or needing help is a constant subliminal message that these women got in the military. No one wants to be viewed as the weak link or the one that people can't depend on. As a result, this can lead to a head down, push through kind of mentality in higher education. Many of the participants in the study, however, did access faculty frequently, which we'll discuss in a minute. This is one of the positive of the schools that scaffold in services. These veterans don't need to ask for help, as it's simply a part of the process. If a veteran is attending a school without these services, they were less likely to use the services past the certifying official. The participants in this study didn't go out of their way to find student veteran peers. As non-traditional students, they weren't looking to create relationships or attend typical college events. And the third finding was navigating higher education, with the first subtheme being the relationship with faculty and faculty as peers. Participants reported largely positive relationships with faculty, with some participants noted that faculty often felt like peers due to their age. There were a few negative interactions with faculty, largely in the earlier eras. Michelle, a veteran of the 1980s peacetime era, had an experience with a male faculty who had a low opinion of the military in general, and an even lower opinion of women who were in the military. And this led to some very tense conversations in the classroom. Some participants attempted to recreate the structure of the military by using faculty office hours. Direct one-on-one explanation and clear instructions often came out of these office hours. And several participants reported people making assumptions related to them going into the military right out of high school, making assumptions about their level of intelligence and why they would have to go into the military. The second subtheme is what they bring to higher education and what they need from higher education. They bring skills, knowledge, and habits from the military to higher education. This facilitates their success. Student veterans also bring discipline, structure, and maturity into the classroom and into their higher education experience. This can sometimes make interactions with traditional age students difficult. As non-traditional students, several of the participants mentioned that being in class with traditional age students, the experiences were mixed, with some being more understanding than others. The ones that were more understanding were often people who had to oversee a lot of people in the military. So finding number one, as I continued to code and recode based on these themes, there were three components that emerged that played an important role in all of the themes. Oops, you know what? I skipped through these. Sorry about that. The components of voice, identity, and culture were present in all of the stories and only became visible the further down that I dug. Not only did they become visible, you were able to see how they connected with the themes and the important role they played in telling the women's stories. When I looked at the three common elements, along with Brofenbrenner's ecological systems theory, I could clearly see the role they played in this research. Ecological systems theory provides a lens to examine the experience of female student veterans transitioning to higher education. It encourages us to look at the context on many different levels that surrounds a person during transition. The voice, using a feminist lens to center women's voices and women's experiences. Identity, understanding the movement between identities, the strength of these identities, and how it's not uncommon to be holding two identities at the same time. Culture, understanding the cross-cultural impact of this transition for the student veterans. The transition into higher education is a cross-cultural transition that needs to be understood as just that. It's a cross-cultural experience, needs to be given the appropriate structure and guidance. This responsibility is shared by both the military and higher education, with higher ed needing to better understand military culture and just what this means for the incoming veteran and student of any gender. Then they need to take one more step and understand what the female veteran experience really is. Understanding veterans as non-traditional students is the first step in this, but only the first step. Transition is not a finite event that occurs in a vacuum, but rather a multi-level, multi-context event that needs to be considered from many different angles. Using Brofenbrenner's ecological model as a framework allows us to examine this event in a more thorough manner than just using transition theory or student identity theory. So we always have implications, we always have findings, we always have, the research is showing that student veterans are focused, goal-oriented, and mission-driven. The transition is cross-cultural. Higher education needs to be a better understanding as veteran of non-traditional students, and using different models than what we are using right now. So we need more research on female veterans. I was so glad to see this conference because it really did show that we are starting to look outside of the box, moving away from using transition theory only and broadening how we experience, how we look at their experience. And we need to have a deeper understanding of the roles that both identity and culture play in this transition. So in closing, the lack of literature on female student veterans in higher education continues to minimize the importance of their experiences by centering more accessible male voices. Women veterans may be a smaller percentage of veterans entering higher ed, and they may be harder to find due to those numbers, but it was my experience that they want to tell their stories. They're enthusiastic when someone wants to listen. The 13 women who took part in this research project were not seeking the spotlight, nor were they seeking any particular recognition. They simply wanted to tell their story in case their story might help another female veteran. Women veterans need to be acknowledged on a wider scale. They are an untapped source of knowledge and information that is waiting to be passed on to those that are attempting to provide other services. Thank you.
Thank you. It was so interesting. And now the second panelist is Michelle with us.
So I just want to say good afternoon, or probably good morning. My name is Michelle, and I'd like to start by saying thank you for the opportunity to present at this conference today. Just to reiterate what Jen said, it's really exciting when I saw the call for papers. And today I'd like to talk to you about a specific research project through the lens of using lived experience as an approach. So firstly, a bit of background regarding this work and to set some context about the data collected and where I am at the moment. So the project began as a PhD thesis a few years ago, in which I sought to better understand how children are seen and engaged with in theatres of armed conflict. And at the time, the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan were ongoing, and it became apparent that children were very much part of the operational landscape, but that there was a lack of training and awareness about what to do when professional military personnel encountered children in hostile environments. So the PhD research was exploratory in nature and sought to better understand the different ways British soldiers encountered children, the roles children played in such conflict zones, and the impact it had on both soldiers' attitudes and practices. So this body of research focused on British soldiers' experiences in Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Sierra Leone, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and drew upon testimonies from former British soldiers who served in these theatres of armed conflict, as well as archival sources, including operational reports, diaries, audio recordings, video footage, etc., from the United Nations, National Army Museum, and the Imperial War Museum. So a big caveat to this, so some of the experiences that I'm going to share with you today, I only spoke to males. This is because at the time of this research, there were no females in a frontline capacity in the operations that I was looking at. And there was a specific focus on speaking to those that had served in a frontline capacity, and in particular in units such as the SAS and the Paras. So very male-dominated units. So this thesis was awarded the Shurin M. Ray Prize, and I was later awarded a Churchill Fellowship to work with the Canadian National Defence HQ and the Veterans Trainers to Eradicate Child Soldiers initiative, led by retired General Romeo Dallaire in Halifax in Canada, to examine the similarities and differences between Canadian and British experiences. And whilst in Canada, I worked with the Canadian veterans who provided oral testimony and insight about their experiences to raise awareness about the moral dilemmas of encountering children in theatre armed conflict, and how to develop pre-deployment training, which is child-focused and meets the needs of the military. So today what I'd like to do is highlight some of the findings from the research, while also highlighting and discussing the benefit of adopting this particular methodological approach when working within the sector, or how about this particular topic. So firstly, why is this topic important, and why do we need to understand the phenomena of children on the battlefield? So recent conflicts have taken place in a much more population-centric environment, with fighting taking place amongst and alongside local populations. There is an increased likelihood of encountering children in conflict zones, either as part of local communities or part of hostile enemy forces. And encountering children can lead to a moral dilemma where professional military personnel are faced with difficult decisions about how to interact or react to children in such circumstances, and this can impact military operations, morale, and psychological well-being. There also remains a paucity of research in this area, and it's been difficult to engage with the British military about the subject. When I first began researching this area, it was very closed ranks, with the MOD and its Ministry of Defence denying that their soldiers see children in conflict zones. And given that the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan were ongoing at the time, this was a troubling and very confusing response. So the MOD response that their personnel don't see children in conflict zones was at odds with the responses from serving and former personnel who were eager to share their story and experiences. And it is these experiences that I would like to share with you today, and to determine what knowledge about children in conflict zones can be gained and what we can learn from talking to personnel about their experiences, and how these experiences can be fed into future training policies and practices. So, what do we mean by lived experience? So according to Davis and Davis in 2007, they describe lived experience as the aim to provide understanding about how people experience, interpret, and feel about certain phenomena in their everyday lives. It provides an insight and understanding from those that have first-hand experience of a particular subject area, and a space or platform where they can help and participate in developing policies, projects, or services. The benefit of using this approach is the ability to learn something new or knowledge about a particular subject area that we as a researcher would have no or limited understanding of. It allows a wider group of people to gain an insight and understanding of a particular issue or phenomena that would otherwise not be understood, and allows people to come together to share their own experience and to discuss commonalities and differences with a view to making change or a project that is centred around or developed with their experiences in mind. However, there's some drawbacks to lived experience research, in particular within a military setting. Firstly, active personnel are not often allowed to engage in such projects. There are restrictions about engaging with researchers or research projects, which often mean that serving personnel are the missing voices. And within this project, we engage with veterans, so former personnel who had served. This meant that their experience, whilst wholly relevant and valid, were missing some of the current operational knowledge or deployment experiences of those that might still be in service. It's also important to ensure that wellbeing measures and support are available for everyone involved, and to ensure that individuals feel respected and listened to. This is particularly important when the group are involved in the co-production or development of a project that might determine the outcome or end product of a project. And it is important there is a space to listen and engage with them. And this is one of the drawbacks from this particular project. So the project was put on hold due to COVID, and it will be resubmitted next year. However, it's an important consideration that once a group is engaged with, that they work together, what are the expectations of the group, what can be achieved, and when working with military institutions, it's important to have interest and buy-in so that the experience shared and work created has a platform or space to be listened to and acknowledged. So, to return to some of the findings from this particular project, the research project was initially British focused and led to the question, how does the presence of children in theatres of armed conflict affect British military operations and the attitudes and practices of British personnel? So it's very important to note that this was an exploratory topic with the aim to understand the individual's experience and their individual perception and understanding about the subject matter. So just very briefly, we'll run through the roles children play, how they've been encountered, the impact on military operations, attitudes towards children, and how their practices changed. With finally a look towards the future about what could be done, potential avenues for further research or work, and then close for discussion. So just before kicking off, I'd just like to provide a definition with regards to the term child soldier and what we mean by children involved in armed conflict. And hopefully on my screen, you can see the 2007 Paris Principles, which refers to any person below 18 years of age who is or has been recruited or used by an armed force or armed group in any capacity, including but not limited to children, boys and girls, used as fighters, cooks, porters, messengers, spies, or for sexual purposes. It does not only refer to a child who is taking or has taken a direct part in hostilities. So, let's talk about some of the findings. The roles children played in armed conflict were varied, and the experiences discussed depended upon the conflict area or region. For example, there was a marked difference between the way soldiers encountered children depending upon the region in which they served. In Northern Ireland, children were used to distract military personnel, stone throwing and the use of catapults were common and directed at personnel delivering aid via convoys. Older children were seen to be carrying weapons, and prams were used to either hide bombs under infants or as roaming explosive devices. In Sierra Leone, this very stereotypical child soldier comes into play, and experiences included seeing lots of young children carrying AK-47s, manning checkpoints and operating alongside adult soldiers. In Iraq and Afghanistan, experiences including seeing children as active participants, as well as suicide bombers. It's also really important to note here that I was interested in the soldier's perspective regarding children who were both active participants and innocent bystanders to the conflict. So the following slides will provide some examples of the various ways children were encountered or used in theatre armed conflict. Please note that some of this may have colloquial, very colloquial language, or there may be some bad language used, as these are obviously people's highlighted experiences. So here we have an experience of one soldier who served in Iraq. He talks about children being used as active participants, where a grenade was launched at the vehicle, and he suggested that the lad was in his early teens. Another example here is about a child being used in terms of creating a diversion or in a crowded situation and what they had to look out for. Another example, this top example here from Northern Ireland, it's me saying that in the Republican areas, there are lots of animosity. Literally, we would drive through in our vehicles and on a patrol or pass through from A to B, and you would have sort of little 7 to 8 year old kids just running out with big piles of stones or bottles that was already sort of piled up, and they would literally just be chucking them at you from the side of the road. People also spoke about children manning checkpoints, and this particular example is from Sierra Leone, where the person in question stated that they were on the checkpoints. A lot of it was bravado, a lot of it was teenage machismo, a little bit of puberty, and a lot of testosterone. And I was shit scared every time I went anywhere near them because you never knew what they were going to do. We also have examples of children being used as suicide bombers and human shields, and both of these examples, the second example was from Iraq. Children could also be used in support roles. They could also be used as dickers. Dickers were quite common in both the Afghanistan and Northern Irish contexts. And we also have examples of children just being children, where somebody is quoted as saying, "The children I encountered weren't doing anything else other than trying to be children in a complicated environment." So from the narratives, it became evident that the presence of children could have a serious impact on military operations. There were instances where airstrikes were called off when children were found to be present within the vicinity, despite enemy fighters firing from the same location. Patrol patterns would change if they knew they had to walk through areas where children were present. And narratives also discussed the use of dirty tactics by the enemy, in which children were used for black propaganda. There are also examples of children being a hindrance to military operations. A few interviewees mentioned the infamous Operation Barras mission in Sierra Leone in 2000, in which a Royal Irish Patrol were captured by a group of child soldiers and then later had to be rescued by the SAS. Themes also emerged across the narratives in regard to soldiers' attitudes towards the child. Some felt sympathy towards the child caught up in a conflict zone. Others felt frustrated there was nothing they could do to help them. And one soldier admitted storing food from his own pack to give to children. There was a feeling of anger towards the enemy that were using children. Some of the interviewees discussed feeling more fearful when children were present, that the child was more likely to be unpredictable and not as rational as an adult soldier. Homesickness was a common feeling amongst fathers who compared the images of the children they were encountering to images of their own children back home. And there was also an element of confusion. Were they children or were they the enemy? The narratives also highlighted how soldiers changed their practices when in the presence of children. They suggest that soldiers would not engage with children at all if the soldier had previously experienced a child in a hostile environment. They would try to discourage other children from approaching them by acting threatening or in a hostile manner, which could be damaging for perceptions. Others suggest that the presence of children made them feel safer, as they did not think the enemy would attack. However, this was not always the case. There also increased pressure on the soldier, who had to gauge whether the child was an innocent or a potential threat, and the need to get it right was vital. For example, there's a quote from a soldier in Northern Ireland who suggested that you have the fear of getting it right. If you shot someone wrong and they were throwing a tomato or a rock and it wasn't a hand grenade, well, that could be quite scary. Practices at checkpoints also altered. In Sierra Leone, one soldier recalled how the practice changed when approaching the checkpoints. He notes that he took his glasses off, he spoke calmly, spoke quietly, be calm, weapon out the way. I'm British, my headdress isn't blue. Make sure they recognise you, recognise the car. Put flags on the car. Had that been of adults, I'd have driven up and said, hi mate, let us through. But because it was not an adult, I became more cautious, not less. So what did we learn? Those on the ground had a wealth of experience, and their experience differed greatly for the organisational narrative that we don't see children in armed conflict. The experiences shared highlighted a greater understanding of the potential for moral dilemmas and the operational implications facing personnel who saw children in conflict situations. Experiences weren't straightforward, and individuals responded and reacted differently to children depending on their own circumstances, situation, conflict environment, the role played by the child, etc. So it's very important to understand the different nuances. And it also highlighted the real-life practical solutions that are needed to such complex problems. And to gain these kind of understanding of the solutions, it's really important to have this lived experience, and for those that had actually experienced such situations to be involved in the development of policy and training to understand this issue better. So just to conclude, hopefully this presentation has provided an insight into the potential dilemma facing military personnel when they encounter children in theatres of armed conflict, and the benefits of using a lived experience approach. Although I have focused on the British experience, this is not purely a British issue, and there is a lot that can be learned from other national militaries and the conflicts they're fighting. And this presentation is just a snapshot of findings which acknowledge that the presence of children can present tactical, operational and emotional challenges. I'd just like to end by saying thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting, both presentation, and we can see, I mean, you can see how related the PAR method and the lived experience methods are, and how we can have so many insights from listening to the participant itself. But I don't think we have any virtual question for now. So do we have some question from the attendee? Yes.
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me? My question is to Dr. Jones. Did you find any differences in your findings for soldiers when the children were perpetrators versus when they were victims?
What I found, so thank you very much for your question. What I found was that soldiers' perceptions were very different, and some soldiers just could not accept that the child had any agency. You know, that they were forced to be in that situation, that the enemy had, you know, put them in that position. Whereas some of the soldiers actually recognised, actually some of these children might have agency, especially those that are of an older age group. So a teenager, you know, a teenage boy in particular would be attributed more agency than maybe a smaller child. What was also quite interesting is the level of sympathy that was given towards the child, particularly depending on how the soldier interpreted the child's agency. So for somebody that was possibly being used in a suicide bomb capacity, you know, they were seen automatically as victims, and there was a lot of sympathy and a lot of anger towards the enemy that was using them. Something that just an anecdote that I didn't touch upon in the presentation, which might be quite interesting to this question, is with regard to, I think I touched upon it on one of the slides, but I didn't actually go into much detail, is the Afghanistan case where both the Afghan National Army and Afghan National Police, who seem to be allies of the British forces, were using boys as catamites. So we're using teenage boys for sexual purposes. And what was really interesting is that although these people, these leaders or individuals in the organisation were deemed to be allies, the soldiers were very very disgusted at what was happening. You know, they were teenage boys, but they attributed a lot of sympathy towards the child and towards the boy about what was going on. And there was a lot of disgust, even though they weren't necessarily seen as being part of the enemy. There was that kind of conflict of interest there.
Thank you. Do we have another? Yes.
So I have a question for Jennifer. You spoke about the challenges that women veterans experience while making the transition to higher education. And I was wondering whether you or the women veterans you interviewed have any ideas to how to make this transition easier for them.
Hi, yes, thank you for that question. Yes, we had a lot of ideas between the 13 women and myself, and some of them revolved around higher education, institutions of higher education really having a better understanding of how to orient and kind of receive veterans, women veteran students in general. A lot of institutions here in the US, the larger ones that have what they call veterans centers, will just kind of direct them to the Veteran Center and expect the Veteran Center to handle the transition and handle the paperwork and all of that. And although they play a large role, the institutions need to step up and create more kind of orientation curriculum and have training with the faculty to have them to kind of dispel the myths that have perpetrated through higher ed about who veterans are and what they bring to the table, and have it become a larger conversation where faculty and administrators both really understand the population that is really a really big population now here in the US in higher ed, because higher ed is a real gateway now for veterans when they leave the service to then move on.
Thank you. So times goes fly, and it's now time for a 5-minute break, and we will then meet again for the last panel of the morning. So thank you, and thank you again for our presenter.